Hi, welcome back, and thank you for joining me on this final video in my Sense and Sensibility series. In this episode, I'm looking at Elinor and Marianne Dashwood together, not separately, because I believe Jane Austen wrote both of them as the heroines in their own right. They don't just represent sense and sensibility, they explore them. And what fascinates me is how each sister ends up learning from the other's emotional world. So this won't be a breakdown of Elinor first and then Marianne. Instead, I'll be looking at how their stories intertwine and how they grow, not apart, but alongside each other. Let's take a look. Now, I don't want to be repeating myself in this video by regurgitating old news, especially if I've mentioned it in previous videos, but it is important to lay the groundwork if we are to understand Elinor and Marianne's growth. As we've seen at the beginning of the story, the Dashwood sisters' world is already falling apart. Their father has died, their half-brother is politely failing to do the decent thing, and suddenly they're being pushed out of their own home. It's a brutal and quiet upheaval, but it shows us how they each respond to their situations. It tells us everything about where they're starting from. The ground shifts beneath their feet. Elinor, being Elinor, is already scanning the ground for stability. She's practical, she's measured, she's looking at what can be done rather than sitting in what's being lost.
We do not need 4 bedrooms, we can share. This one, then. Marianne, we have only £500 a year.
She doesn't deny grief, but she manages it, almost as if emotions are something to file away and deal with in private, perhaps at a later date. Marianne, meanwhile, well, she goes full Marianne. She's devastated. Everything's too much, too unfair, too sudden. And to be fair, it is.
I had not thought it would be so soon.
Have they no heart at all?
It is their house now, Marianne.
How can you be so calm about it? Oh, Mother, don't cry, dear.
She feels it with her whole body. Her response isn't irrational, it's just unfiltered. She doesn't want to adjust. She wants the world to match the intensity of what she's feeling. And when it doesn't, she recoils. What I'm thinking here is that Austen is not setting one reaction up as right and one as wrong. She's just putting the two emotional styles under the same roof and letting us watch the tension. Mrs. Dashwood, a grown-up Marianne? Now let's talk about their mother, because she's not just wallpaper in this story. In many ways, she's a key to understanding both of the sisters. In my opinion, she's basically a romantic spirit who got lucky in marriage. She loved her husband, lived comfortably, and never really had to think too hard about the practical side of life until it collapsed around her.
Mama, our brother has a kind heart. He wouldn't want you to be uncomfortable.
So she responds to the crisis like a softer version of Marianne, with emotion first and logic somewhere far behind. And suddenly Elinor, at just 19, becomes the emotional anchor for everyone. Elinor's not just being sensible, she's taking on adult responsibilities that maybe shouldn't have landed on her so soon. One of my viewers in a previous video said something that really stuck with me. They called Elinor the adult in the family. And honestly, I think that nails it. She's the only one doing the invisible work of holding things together. And that's a heavy load to carry. And it's one that never gets properly acknowledged, not even by the people closest to her. Barton Cottage and the new normal. When they finally settle at Barton Cottage, you'd think the emotional dust might start to settle, but instead we get another layer of contrast.
Elinor, can we really settle here, do you think? Of course we can.
Elinor adjusts, she gets on with things. She's not thrilled about the reduced circumstances, but she adapts politely and quietly. Marianne, on the other hand, sees it all as tragic and unjust. She's still clinging to the world she should be living in, the one she thought she was entitled to by nature, of being young, beautiful, and full of poetry. Now, I'm not sure if this is what Austen meant, but to me, Barton Cottage is almost like a pressure cooker. It forces these two sisters to live in close emotional proximity than ever. There's nowhere to hide. Eleanor's composure becomes even more composed. Marianne's dramatics become even more dramatic, and neither one quite knows what to do with the other, the emotional languages they speak. Now, here's a thought. Elinor and Marianne are fluent in two different emotional dialects. Elinor speaks subtext, everything unspoken, carefully measured, filtered through reason, and Marianne speaks opera, grand, sweeping, all or nothing. They're trying to connect, but they don't always hear each other properly.
Why so grave? Do you disapprove her choice?
By no means.
And Austen, of course, lets us feel that discord. She doesn't force them to reconcile quickly. She just lets them be human, different, imperfect, and learning slowly that understanding someone doesn't always mean agreeing with them. Why this start matters. I think this opening stretch of the story, the inheritance loss, the move, the emotional adjustment, it's not just background noise, it's emotional architecture. Because before Austen can explore love and heartbreak and moral growth, she shows us what these sisters are starting with. One is already building a wall, the other's throwing open the windows, but they're both in their own ways, just trying to survive a life they didn't choose. So here we are, Elinor and Marianne, both seemingly on the cusp of love. Marianne has Willoughby, the charming, dashing, poetry reciting hero straight out of her romantic ideals. Elinor has Edward Ferrars, awkward, shy, and deeply unexciting on paper, but still there's something there, or at least it feels like there is. What I'm thinking here is that Austen is deliberately setting us up to expect two classic love stories, but she's already planting the idea that neither of these will be what the sisters think they are. Willoughby, all flame, no fuel. Marianne falls hard and fast. Willoughby makes it easy. He rescues her, reads with her, mirrors her emotions like he's auditioning for her diary.
Oh, very much. Oh, I see you're reading Pope.
And she doesn't just fall in love, she falls into a narrative. She believes she's in a romantic novel and that Willoughby is her hero straight out of a Byron novel with windswept hair and tragic backstory. But what she doesn't see, and maybe can't see yet, is that he's not emotionally anchored. He plays with intensity without having the depth to sustain it. When he leaves suddenly, she's gutted. And what makes it worse is that he doesn't offer closure.
It is folly to linger in this manner. I will not torment myself further.
Marianne's heartbreak isn't just about losing him, it's about losing the story she thought she was living. It's her emotional worldview cracking. Elinor and Edward, love in slow motion. Elinor's experience is almost the opposite. Her connection with Edward is quiet, steady, and almost ambiguous. There's no grand declaration, no dramatic moment, just a slow-growing respect, a kind of wordless bond. She feels something real and hopes silently that he does too. And then, of course, she finds out he's been engaged to someone else the whole time. Now, here's the thing. She doesn't scream or sob or throw herself on a chaise longue. She just folds it in. She keeps the secret, carries the pain, and never burdens anyone else with it, which is noble, but also lonely. In my opinion, this is where we really start to see the cost of Elinor's sense. She's been so careful not to burden anyone else that she forgets she's allowed to feel heartbreak herself. Secrets that hurt in different ways. So both sisters are deceived, and the pain lands differently. Marianne feels betrayed by romantic illusion. She thought she was the heroine of a grand love, only to find herself cast aside. Elinor feels betrayed by emotional honesty. She thought she and Edward understood each other, and suddenly that understanding is full of holes. So one sister collapses outward, the other collapses inward. What's fascinating to me here is that Marianne's heartbreak forces her to confront consequences, that feelings, no matter how genuine, don't protect you from hurt. Eleanor's heartbreak, on the other hand, reveals how damaging it can be to keep everything inside, even if it looks noble from the outside. And then there's Colonel Brandon. Brandon floats gently in the background, older, quieter, less sparkly. At this point in the story, he's the exact opposite of everything Marianne wants.
I think Colonel Brandon has a little more discernment than your usual audience.
I think he's the sort of man that likes to find fault with everybody and everything.
He doesn't dazzle, he doesn't sweep her off her feet, but he watches, he listens, and when things fall apart, he's there without asking for attention or reward. I'm not sure if Austen meant this quite so literally, but I've always felt Brandon, to me at least, was like Marianne's future standing quietly in the background of her present. She's still wrapped up in the intensity of first love, and he's something steadier, more grounded, not what she wants yet, but perhaps what she'll come to understand later. Elinor, for her part, appreciates Brandon almost immediately, not romantically, but as a kind of kindred spirit. They both understand what it's like to suffer quietly, to love someone who might not love you back, and to care without complaint. There's a mutual recognition there, even if it never becomes anything more. Love isn't the ending, it's the test. If this were a simple novel, the romance would be the payoff. But Austen's smarter than that. She uses these relationships to test her characters, to push them emotionally, morally, and even socially. For Marianne, the test is humility. Can she recognize that her feelings aren't the only truth, that people can hurt you and still be complicated? For Elinor, the test is vulnerability. Can she admit she's heartbroken? Can she feel without apologizing for it? So neither of them passes with flying colours, but that's the point. They grow through failure, not perfection. Austen doesn't give us fantasy, she gives us women who learn. By this point in the story, both sisters have been walking their own emotional tightropes. Elinor balancing her inner life with outer composure, and Marianne refusing to balance anything at all. It's a strange sort of standoff. One is silently drowning, and the other is defiantly gasping in public. And Austen lets that tension build and build until it has to snap. This section of the novel and the phases of their emotional journey is when everything starts to unravel. The walls close in. What I'm thinking here is that Barton Cottage, which at first felt like a rustic retreat, starts to become emotionally claustrophobic. It's not just the physical space, it's the pressure. Elinor is carrying the secret of Edward's engagement. Marianne is spiraling in heartbreak and denial, and everyone around them keeps talking. Sir John Middleton, bless him, is still trying to cheer everyone up with dinners and card games. He means well, but his relentless sociability is so at odds with both sisters and what they need, and it becomes almost a comic tension.
Oh, are we never to have a moment's peace? The rent here may be low, but I believe we have it on very hard terms.
Elinor can fake her way through it. Marianne can't. And then there's Mrs. Jennings, who starts as a bit of a caricature. Loud, noisy, socially inappropriate.
I think I shall try a little experiment on him.
Oh, no. Mrs. Jennings, please, leave the poor Colonel alone.
No, my dear, it's just the thing. All suitors need a little help.
But slowly reveals herself to be something else entirely. Genuinely kind-hearted. She may gossip, but she cares. And that unexpected warmth matters later, especially to Elinor, when she starts to crack. Marianne's collapse. And it's not just about Willoughby. Marianne's illness, the literal physical collapse, is the outward symbol of what's been happening internally for for several chapters. She's been broken emotionally, and now her body follows suit. What's so interesting here is that it's not just about Willoughby anymore. It's about everything. The emotional indulgence, the lack of boundaries, the refusal to see the world as it is. And it all comes crashing down. And for the first time, Marianne becomes vulnerable, not just in spirit, but also in survival. This is also where Brandon steps in as more than just a waiting love interest. He becomes action, concern, and care. While Marianne still can't quite process him emotionally, Austen starts to guide the reader gently towards seeing him not as second best, but as real. Elinor breaks, quietly and almost alone. While all of this is happening, Elinor is still holding the line, still managing, still enduring. But Lucy appears and lingers, still smug, still flaunting what she knows, still forcing Elinor to sit across from her and smile politely through clenched restraint. Now, this is where Austen really turns the screw. Lucy, with her self-satisfied smirk and social calculation, has everything Elinor wants and none of what she deserves. Watching Elinor sit through Lucy's self-congratulatory drivel, knowing full well she has every right to scream, is honestly one of the most emotionally loaded scenes in the entire novel. And Austen writes it with surgical precision. And then comes the moment when Edward arrives at Barton, nervous, fumbling, and finally reveals the truth. Lucy has married his brother, and he is free. And of course, Elinor cries.
So now you can marry Ellen.
That might not sound like much, but for Elinor, it's seismic. One tear from Elinor is equal to 10 chapters of Marianne flinging herself onto pianofortes. Not just a release, it's a shift. And for the first time, Elinor allows herself to be looked after. She lets someone else carry the emotional weight. What these cracks reveal. This whole stretch, the illness, the secrecy, the awkward dinners, the emotional carnage, is not just drama, it's reconstruction. Elinor learns that holding everything in doesn't protect her, it isolates her. Marianne learns that romantic intensity isn't resilience, it's a kind of fragility dressed up in passion. And both sisters are changed by the people around them, not just the men, but the whole cast. Mrs. Jennings, Lucy, Brandon, even Willoughby. Because like we said before, Austen doesn't do filler characters. Every conversation, every social call, every faux pas is there to help these women become more than they were when we first met them. Tipping, but not toppling. I see this section as the emotional turning point. It's not a neat resolution. Austen never wraps things up quickly, but it's the beginning of something. That moment when both sisters stop standing still and start inching very subtly towards something like growth. And that's why this part matters so much. It's not just Marianne's fever or Elinor's tears, it's that both of them, in completely different ways, finally bend. And thank goodness for it, because in Austen's world, if you can't bend, you'll break. Now, I marvel at Austen's ability to weave such intricate stories, and for those who don't dig deep enough, they risk missing the subtleties and emotional nuances she sets so carefully in place. This isn't just storytelling, it's quiet, crafted insight, and sometimes I wonder how many people miss it entirely because they're perhaps too distracted by bonnets and ballrooms. We often talk about character arcs as if there's a neat turning point, a single moment where something changes. But Austen doesn't work like that. Her characters shift slowly, sometimes awkwardly, often without fanfare. In my opinion, that's what makes her so compelling. She understands that emotional growth isn't a plot twist, it's a process. And in this part of the story, we start to see Elinor and Marianne move past reaction into something more reflective. Marianne especially starts to reassemble herself, not by abandoning her romantic spirit, but by realizing that passion without perspective is a dangerous thing. And Elinor, having finally allowed herself to be vulnerable, starts to soften in ways that feel freeing. There's less holding on, less performing strength. Marianne finds stillness. After her illness, Marianne is changed, not in some moralistic punished for her sensibility way, but in a way that feels genuinely transformative. She starts to see the shape of her past behavior. She doesn't renounce her emotions, but she begins to understand that indulging them to the point of collapse isn't noble, it's isolating. I've always loved the quietness of this shift. Austen doesn't give her a big dramatic speech. Marianne doesn't suddenly wake up a cynic. Instead, she just slows down, reads different books, walks more gently through the world, and that's what growth actually looks like.
Do you compare your conduct with his?
No.
She even admits, in a moment of quiet clarity, that Elinor had it right all along. Not that Elinor was better, but she had something Marianne needed to learn.
I compare it with what it ought to have been. I compare it with yours.
That kind of humility is hard to come by, and it's one of the reasons I think Marianne's journey is one of Austen's most satisfying. Now, I know that some readers and many viewers of the screen adaptations kind of struggle with Marianne early on, and I've seen the comments. She's selfish, she's dramatic, she's exhausting, and yes, she is, but I think that's exactly Austen's point. She starts there so that we can see the arc. If she didn't begin with such unchecked emotional intensity, her transformation wouldn't feel nearly as earned. And for the actresses who've taken her on, portraying that evolution with credibility, that's no small task. And let's be honest, if you find yourself getting annoyed with Marianne in the early chapters, then Austen's probably doing her job. She wrote her that way deliberately. Austen gives us the raw material first, so we feel the shift when it finally happens. And honestly, if you're reacting to Marianne like she's a real person without seeing the design behind her flaws, then Austen's caught you. Hook, line, and sinker. Elinor lets go a bit. Elinor's growth isn't as dramatic, but it's equally important. Where Marianne had to rein herself in, Elinor needed to loosen her grip. And I think what we see now is a version of Elinor who is no longer trying to control everything, emotionally or otherwise. She still values restraint, but she's not afraid of feeling. There's even a touch of lightness to her, a sense that she's no longer carrying quite so much on her own. Whether it's the release of finally crying or the realization she doesn't always have to be the strong one, there's been a shift. What I'm thinking here is that Austen gives Elinor space not to change into someone new, but to become more fully herself. And there's something really lovely in that. Looking at each other, not just past each other. One of the most beautiful parts at this stage, and that's easy to miss, is how the sisters began to really see each other. Early in the story, they're mostly talking around each other. Marianne finds Elinor cold. Elinor finds Marianne exhausting. Neither really understands the emotional language the other is speaking. But now, there's mutual respect. Marianne sees how much strength it took Elinor to stay composed. Elinor sees how deeply Marianne has to wrestle with grief, pride, and disappointment. So they're no longer opposites, they're companions. They've been tested in completely different ways, but both come out of it wiser. Not because they became someone else, but because they added emotional tools they didn't have at the beginning. Austen's version of adulthood. I'm not sure Austen would use the word maturity the way that we use it now, as a kind of finished state. But I do think this part of the novel shows what she believes adulthood should look like. Emotional balance, empathy, a willingness to admit fault, and the capacity to grow without losing your core. Elinor hasn't abandoned sense. Marianne hasn't killed off sensibility, but each of them now holds a little of each other's strength. And that, to me, is Austen's emotional ideal. No stoicism, no indulgence, just integration. So after all of it, the heartbreak, the illness, the secrets, the silences, where do we land? We started with two sisters who seemed like opposites, one full of composure, the other full of feeling. And for a while, it's easy to read them that way. Austen even nudges us in that direction. Sense and sensibility, she says. You almost expect to be tested on it. One of those, pay attention, I'll be asking questions later moments. It feels so clearly defined until it's not. But now, looking back, I don't think Austen's goal was to pit one against the other. What I'm seeing here is more like emotional balancing, where each sister slowly gains what the other instinctively had. Marianne doesn't become Elinor, and Elinor doesn't become Marianne, but they each come away changed by what they've witnessed, suffered, and shared. Why their journeys matter. In my opinion, what makes these arcs so satisfying isn't that they learn their lesson, but that their growth feels earned. Marianne doesn't renounce her love of poetry or stop feeling things deeply, but now she can step back and reflect rather than react. And Elinor doesn't abandon her principles, but she realizes that protecting others doesn't mean burying yourself. This isn't moralizing, it's humanizing, and it's Austen at her most brilliant. She lets her characters grow without punishing them or turning them into something that they're not. And we as readers or viewers of the adaptations are taken on that same journey. Any prejudices we had early on are slowly unraveled. That moment when you realize you've misunderstood a character, that's not a flaw in the writing, that's Austen pulling the strings like a puppet master or mistress, quietly, gently, brilliantly. Everyone around them played a part. Now here's something I find fascinating. These sisters didn't grow in isolation. Every character around them, even the ones we love to loathe, helped shape their development. Willoughby, for all his failings, forces Marianne to confront what it means to trust blindly. Lucy Steele tests Elinor's strength in ways no stormy romance ever could. Brandon and Edward both show what quiet loyalty looks like in action. Mrs. Jennings, Sir John, and Margaret, and even the Palmers, they each press, poke, and hold up a mirror to the sisters at crucial moments. Austen gives us a full ecosystem of personalities, temperaments, and emotional languages, not to distract from Elinor and Marianne, but to form them. Growth as Austen's quiet revolution. What I love about how Austen tells this story is that she resists grand declarations. She doesn't say, Marianne learned humility or Elinor found her emotions. She just shows us two young women getting a little bit wiser, a little bit softer, and a little bit stronger, and doing so through experience. So in an era where women has so little control over their circumstances, Austen makes emotional growth an act of quiet revolution. There's no grand act of defiance here, just a steady refusal to be boxed in by emotional expectations. That's radical in its own quiet way. The Dashwood sisters revisited. So after all this talk of Sense and Sensibility, what are we really left with? Two women, both changed, both full of versions of themselves, both shaped by love, loss, disappointment, and kindness, both walking away from the story not victorious, but whole, complete. And maybe that's Austen's final message here, that we don't need to choose between sense and sensibility. We need to understand that real life and real love usually requires a bit of both. And if you ask me, and I've said this before, you don't always need a therapist. Sometimes you just need to read a Jane Austen novel, then take a long, hard look in the mirror and find yourself asking whether you're being the Elinor someone else needs or the Marianne you're pretending not to be. So if you've made it this far and you're still here with me, thank you. Really, thank you. This has been quite a journey through Sense and Sensibility, hasn't it? And whether this is your first Austen novel or your 15th time returning to it, I do hope it's offered something new, a detail you hadn't noticed or maybe missed, a character you now see a little differently, or just a feeling that these stories have something to say to you. What I love about Austen is that her characters don't just exist on the page, they evolve in our heads, and I think in our hearts too. Elinor and Marianne have taught me things I didn't expect to learn when I first opened the book all those years ago. And talking through these things with you here has been one of the great joys of this project for me. The end of the series, not the end of Austen. Now, this is where I'd usually wrap things up with a neat little bow, but that doesn't feel quite right for Austen, does it? Her stories really don't end. They just step aside and let life carry on. So yes, this is the end of my Dashwood series, but not the end of these characters, and definitely not the end of us talking about Austen. In fact, I'm already planning my next series, which will take us into the world of persuasion. A different tone, a different heroine, but still very much Austen. And I'll tell you more on that soon. You, me, and Jane Austen. I started this whole series thinking I was going to share my view, my ideas about Austen's characters. What I didn't expect was the conversations, the insights you've offered in the comments, the way you've engaged with the ideas, challenged them, added to them, corrected me. That's what made this feel alive. So if you've got thoughts about Elinor, about Marianne, about Austen's writing, about your own emotional journey through the story, please do share them. I always read the comments. I respond to as many as I can. And I learn from them. And I genuinely look forward to seeing what you think. Elinor and Marianne may have learned from each other, but maybe we've learned a little from them too. So until next time, take care of yourself. Be gentle to your own internal Elinor, and let your inner Marianne go running off through the poppy fields. And keep walking through Jane Austen's stories with curiosity. I'll see you soon. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.